So now I want to turn away from Nero to the other prime character of this tale, the victim, but also villain, Agrippina. I said quite a lot about Agrippina in my course on Annals 12, and you can go back there if you're interested. There's a segment on all about her. Just in a nutshell, she is a tremendously powerful woman in the 1st century AD. She was the sister of Caligula, the wife and niece of Claudius, and the mother of Nero. She is the best connected woman in the Roman Principate, and arguably in the whole of Roman history, up to the lifetime of Tacitus at least, and a very powerful one. She's an interesting, nuanced character in our part of the tale, her fall and death, for a different reason though. On the one hand, she is the victim, and being a victim does tend to make you prone to get a bit of pathos in most forms of narrative. And in several ways, she actually puts in quite an impressive performance. Here, you might quote Malcolm's words in Macbeth, adapt them rather, "Nothing in her life became her like the leaving it." So the best thing she does is die, or rather the way she dies. On the other hand, Tacitus doesn't suddenly switch from painting her as a black character to a white character. She remains a problematic character, and there's a strong contrast you can draw here with Octavia, who is a truly innocent victim, as Tacitus depicts it at the end of Book 14. So what we have is one nasty person, Nero, killing another, Agrippina, which makes for a particularly entertaining form of drama and also characteristically bleak Tacitian scenario. There aren't many good people in the Principate as he depicts it. Now, just briefly looking back at what happens in Book 13, I talked a little bit about this already when I talked about Nero in Book 13. Having been the kind of evil power behind Nero's rise, her influence rapidly starts to fade, and it has this major diminution with her kind of fall from grace in AD 55 over the Acti affair. I didn't say then, and will now fill in now, she faces a very an existential threat after that, because what happens is people sense that her power is on the wane, and so they come in and attack her by accusing her of planning to have an affair with rebellious Plautus. This is a distant relative of Nero's, and supplant Nero as emperor. So effectively a charge of treason. She faces it down with a brilliant speech. It's the most exciting, it's the only speech in Book 13, the only big direct speech. It's in paragraph 21. And she defends herself, says, well, of course, I haven't done this. And she appeals to the perversity of the idea of Nero having his mother killed. So this is her kind of last great moment of strength and power, but also obviously, with hindsight, a very strong presentiment of what's to come 4 years later, because of course Nero is going to kill her. And Tacitus then makes her disappear from the book. So rather implausibly, she does nothing for 4 years, between early 55 and early 59. And that could be that this probably reflects in part a degree to which she's kind of been pushed out of the centre of power, but it's also surely a dramatic effect. By making her almost be forgotten about, it makes it an exciting moment when she suddenly comes back into the narrative at the start of Book 14. Now, as for Book 14, how does she come across in the matricide? Well, as I said, in some ways she's very impressive on her own terms. She is an artful survivor. She knows to be suspicious when Nero invites her to dinner. In Tacitus's version of the story, and there are slightly different versions told by different people, she refuses to get on the boat first time round because she suspects a ploy, and it's only after a long dinner that she's softened up, presumably had a drink or two as well, and agrees to take the boat back. Now, it's true that Tacitus does qualify this with a phrase he uses in the same scene. He talks about women's easy credulity at happy news, facili feminarum credulitate ad gaudia. Now, that would imply, A, it's typically misogynistic, sort of generalising about all women. If that's Tacitus's view, it seems to suggest that although he's kind of forgotten his characterisation of Agrippina as a really wily woman, there are two riders to that. One is that the way the sentence is written, he could be focalising it, which is, it could be Nero's thought that he's representing there rather than his own. And second, it is true that although Agrippina is very wily, this is the moment at which she will indeed be undone. She does, though, show her mettle. When the boat collapses, she keeps her cool, she stays silent, which proves to be very important because the person, her maid Acheronia or friend Acheronia, when she claims to be Agrippina, gets clubbed to death. So Agrippina is cunning, she stays silent, and she swims back to shore, which is quite an impressive feat. I think there are very few, possibly even no other testimonies of women doing serious swimming. This is swimming in the sea as well. So she's not some kind of delicate flower. Most impressive, though, in Tacitus's terms, is the way she responds after that. She kind of licks her wounds, metaphorically, and then she realises that the only remedy for the plot was if it was not understood. Now, that's a paradox, of course. She has understood the plot. Tacitus has abbreviated what he's saying to make it paradoxical. What he means is the only way to survive was to appear not to understand what had happened. Because if Nero realised that she knew, then he would definitely kill her. In fact, he's going to kill her anyway. But it encapsulates a core idea for Tacitus, that you survive in the Principate by feigning not to know things. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on. The death scene itself is kind of the climax of the story. Paragraph 8 is heavy with pathos. We have this crowd scene sort of building the drama and incidentally implying that Agrippina was very popular with the common people, as it were. Then comes this nasty death squad. They break down the door. We zoom in slowly through the villa into the bedroom. Then Agrippina's one companion leaves her. There's only a single light in the bedroom. It's a fantastically dramatic picture. And we then zoom in on Agrippina's own thoughts as she gets more and more nervous. And then the final confrontation between her and the freedman Anicetus, who supervises it, and then the two marine officers who actually kill her. Famously, she gets a whole series actually of direct quotations, which is another way of creating drama and investing and kind of giving her authority, as it were, in the scene. The last of which is this famous moment. She thrusts out her belly, her womb, Tacitus says, and says, "Ventrem ferri, strike the belly." Short, sharp, and very snappy. It's fantastic sort of last words. It's very telling because it sums up a whole idea there. The point is, strike my womb, because this is where Nero came from. So I'm being killed by the thing I bore. But also a moment of great defiance, bravery. She doesn't shrink. She doesn't beg for mercy. She says, "Come on, kill me." She's really resolute. Now, this is a good instance of something we see all through the works of Tacitus and in quite a lot of other works of this period, a real love of the noble death. Ideally, suicide. That is the best form of death as far as many Romans are concerned. The background to this is Stoic, and the ultimate examples are Socrates, not himself a Stoic, but he becomes the model of the brave death. And then in Roman history, Cato the Younger, who commits suicide rather than accept the Principate of Julius Caesar, or the dictatorship of Julius Caesar. And by Tacitus's period, because of emperors like Nero, you have a pretty rich history of people committing suicide for various reasons. And to commit suicide nobly is clearly a really impressive thing in this culture. And you see how Tacitus reacts to that by writing up some fantastic suicide scenes. The biggest and best, perhaps, is Thrasea the senator who's rather intransigent, who becomes an opponent of Nero. The very last thing we have in the annals, at the end of book 16, it's not the end of the book, but it's where it gets cut off before we lose the rest, is a great big death scene. Literally, Thrasea is just cutting open his veins as the book ebbs away. It's quite an amazing end by accident. And another great one is the death of the Emperor Otho. He's a good comparison with Agrippina. In the histories about the civil war of 68, 69, Tacitus makes Otho really quite a nasty character. He's the second emperor in the year of 4 emperors. But the one thing he does, which is great, is commit suicide, so as not to prolong the war when it becomes clear that his army is going to be defeated by Vitellius. And at that moment, Tacitus pivots from having been really nasty about him to giving him a fantastic death scene. The technical term for this is an exitus. Exitus is one of the words meaning death, and exitus literature was a big thing at the period. So Otho, a little bit like Agrippina, I think is a little bit like Otho, not quite to the same extent, but she pivots from being very nasty to being still nasty, but also kind of impressive. Now, of course, Agrippina doesn't commit suicide, but a defiant death, so allowing someone to murder you but not pleading for mercy, is the good best second to committing suicide. And the classic instance of that is Pompey. If you look at Lucan's Civil War, the end of the 8th book, he gives a huge death scene to Pompey, who is bravely facing death on the shores of Egypt. And the other classic Tacitus instance, taking us back to the histories again, I know I'm giving you quite a lot to read here, is Galba in Book 1 of the Histories. Galba, the first emperor to die in the year of the 4 emperors. And I focus on him in particular because there's a strange and interesting echo between his death and Agrippina's. Galba holds out, according to one story, he holds out his neck and says, "Come on, strike." So just as Agrippina holds out her womb and says, "Come on, strike." Another noble death by an emperor, as Agrippina is a kind of empress. So all of that to illustrate the way that death is a cultural obsession and it is kind of aestheticized, fetishized. And those are some of the reasons why Tacitus gives such a lot of coverage to Agrippina, and I think why he allows her death to become this moment of glory for her. The aftermath of her death, this is paragraph 9, is also ennobling in several ways. You get pathos in her quick cremation and the simple burial she eventually gets. She doesn't get it until after Nero dies, so it's many years later. And its location. Tacitus takes a moment to say it was near a villa of Julius Caesar, he calls him the dictator Julius, which looks out from a lofty position on the bays beneath. And the Latin is subjecto sinus, which literally means subservient bays. It's rare that he should pause for topographical detail. The Annals generally operates in abstracts. It doesn't do much depiction of physical appearances or locations or whatever. It thinks more about minds and psychologies and power. And also a very rare moment of natural beauty. So it just adds a degree more pathos again, and as I say, a degree of nobleness. There's also a hint in that topography, this villa overlooking the bays from on high, of Agrippina's own grandeur and power, and by mention of Julius Caesar, specifically her political dominance, her political power. There's also her impressive scorn for death recurs once more at the end of this paragraph when Tacitus goes back in time to refer to something that allegedly happened many years previous, a prophecy Agrippina received that Nero would become emperor one day but would also kill her, to which she replied famously, "Occidat dum imperet, let him kill me as long as he rule." So again, she's nobly accepting death as the price of her rather less noble scheming to get Nero into power. Now, what you can see here is this paragraph is doubling as a kind of obituary, especially that last tale going back. It's summing up Agrippina's life in a pregnant moment. I hope it's not perverse to use the word pregnant just here. Occidat dum imperet, this another ultima vox, another set of last words that just capture it all. So all that by way of saying Agrippina gets a very impressive portrait in several ways, but there is another side, and this is where I want to end. First of all, the tyranny theme. Let me start by continuing with that quotation, Occidat dum imperet, because that is clearly an echo of another very famous quotation by the tyrant Atreus. Atreus, a tyrant in myth, and in a play by the Roman tragedian Accius, which we don't have most of, Atreus famously says, of the people of around him, of Argos, oderint dum metuant. Let them hate me, provided they fear me. And this becomes the absolute badge of the tyrant in Roman literature. Indeed, Caligula is said himself to have used it, so life imitates art. Occidat dum imperet, oderint dum metuant. You can see you've got the same types of subjunctives, the same structure. You even get the echo of occidat against oderint with that initial O. All of this is one of the reasons why, as so often, Agrippina's last words are just a bit too good to be true. It's not massively likely that she said quite what Tacitus says. He's formed it in this very neat way that makes us think of Atreus. I suppose other people might think Agrippina herself was deliberately imitating Atreus, but that's a matter of opinion. But either way, what it does is it aligns Agrippina with one of the great tyrants of myth. So we've got the idea of Agrippina as a sort of tyrant figure. Of course, she never does become emperor, but she tyrannizes Rome by manipulating the empire. And that's a theme Tacitus has kept live. Back at the start of this section, this is 14.2, he has this metaphor of her burning for power. Even after Nero's accession, she's burning to have power within his rule. And that echoes something he said right at the start of book 13 too. She's aflame with desire for wicked mastery. So this idea of Agrippina's evil inclinations is certainly being kept live. Second, Tacitus doesn't let us forget other negatives. When she's reflecting on the boat escapade and preparing her counterattack, which is to feign not to know anything, she does one thing, Tacitus says, which is another thing which is certainly not out of character. She makes sure that she gets the will of Acheronia, the woman who died on the boat, and found, and that all Acheronia's possessions are made over to her, Agrippina. So her greed, which is something he's thematized earlier, stays with her to the last. Second and biggest, the incest claims. This is paragraph 2 of the book. Now here Tacitus is very naughty. He reports 2 different versions at second hand. Firstly, that Agrippina tried to seduce Nero as a way to try and keep him on side. And secondly, a different version from a different historian, that Nero wanted to sleep with Agrippina and he was prevented from doing so. Now Tacitus doesn't actually endorse either account, nor does he say actually that this sex happened, something that Suetonius implies. But he does say the first option is more likely. It's more likely, he says, Agrippina was the one who tried to seduce Nero. And he says either because it's true or because, and instead of an argument here, he then gives, as it were, an argument from character. He says, because Agrippina had done performed a whole load of sexual misdemeanors in her life. And he rattles off a series of affairs she'd had and ends with the fact she'd had incestuous marriage with her uncle Claudius. Now, this is very sneaky because sort of in pure logic, that list of misdemeanors is an argument. It's a reason for thinking that she might have tried to seduce Nero. But it actually becomes an end in itself because it doubles, A, it's the last thing in the paragraph, so it sticks in your mind, and B, it doubles as another sort of obituary of Agrippina, anticipated because she's not dead yet, but instead of looking back over her career in all its different manifestations, he just gives us a career of Agrippina as sexual miscreant. And that's obviously a very nasty thing to do. You can see, as Tacitus, exactly as he's claiming to be a historian by doing source criticism, saying here are 2 different accounts, which one's right, he's actually playing the orator, that is the person who's skilled at implanting in the minds of a jury in court a particular image of someone's character and therefore whether or not they will care for them very much. So there we are. We have quite a nuanced picture, I think, of Agrippina. Definitely a victim and quite a heroic one in various ways, but certainly still a villain too.